To all free stalkers, loners, eggheads in their bunkers, and even those currently hiding from military patrols in the cold mud of the perimeter. This is Tina. You are listening to the zone's echo frequency. It's night outside, the sky is choked with leaden clouds, and my Geiger counter is quietly clicking away, a constant reminder that we are only temporary guests in this cursed place. Tonight, I want to share a few stories with you. These aren't the cheap campfire tales you hear tossed around at the 100 Rads bar over a bottle of Karsak's vodka, meant to scare the greenhorns. This is what actually happened to me. Things that make your blood run cold. Things that prove the zone isn't just about radiation, anomalies, or mutated beasts. It is something much deeper. Something aware. Something that watches us. Get comfortable by your fires, check your weapons, and listen closely. We are beginning. Part 1. The Trap in the Red Forest. This story happened a long time ago, back when I was still completely green. I was maybe 25, devoid of the scars, the twitchy paranoia, and the primal survival instinct that keeps me alive today. I used to love going on solo raids. I know, it sounds like absolute lunacy to anyone who has spent more than a week here, but back then, I craved the sensation of total isolation. No radio chatter, no unreliable partners to watch your back, just you, your rifle, and the breathing lungs of the zone. On this particular run, I had pushed far beyond the usual safe trails, edging dangerously close to the northern outskirts of the Red Forest. For 2 days, everything was terrifyingly perfect. The weather was dead quiet, I hadn't spotted a single mutant, and the anomalies were easy to read, shimmering faintly in the cool air. But by the afternoon of the second day, the sky to the west turned the color of a bruised corpse. And I'm not talking about a regular thunderstorm. The air suddenly tasted like copper and old blood. A radioactive storm was rolling in, the undeniable harbinger of a blowout. The wind began to howl with such ferocity that the mutated, rust-colored pines were bending in half. A torrential, freezing downpour started. I was caught in the open, lugging a ridiculously overpacked canvas rucksack, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. If I didn't find solid cover in the next 10 minutes, the zone's sudden emission would liquefy my nervous system. Through the impenetrable wall of rain, a jagged silhouette materialized. It was a small wooden cabin, half swallowed by the overgrown, twisted thickets. It looked like an old forester's hut, a rotting relic from before the 1986 disaster. Adrenaline masking my exhaustion, I threw myself at the structure, nearly shattering the warped door with my shoulder. Inside, it was pitch black. The air was suffocatingly thick, reeking of damp rot, wet earth, and something vaguely metallic. But it was dry. I collapsed onto the dust-caked floorboards, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. When I finally clicked on my tactical flashlight, the beam cut through the gloom. The furnishings were skeletal: a rotting wooden table, a single chair missing a leg, and the rusted iron frame of a bed. It was only when my breathing slowed and the immediate panic subsided that I began to truly observe my surroundings. In the far corner, nestled near the bed frame, lay a sleeping bag. It wasn't some moth-eaten Soviet surplus gear. It was modern, synthetic, and relatively clean. On the table sat a few opened cans of tourist breakfast and a plastic water jug. Someone had been using this forgotten hut as a stash or a temporary camp. However, the longer the beam of my flashlight lingered on the details, the more a cold dread began to pool in my stomach. I swept the light toward the door. The wood around the frame was completely mutilated. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of deep, frantic scratches. They were chaotic, overlapping gouges, as if someone or something had been clawing at the thick timber in a state of absolute, mindless panic. I stepped closer, my hands trembling slightly as I inspected the door's locking mechanism. There was no latch, no deadbolt, no handle on the inside. Nothing. Slowly, I pulled the door open a crack, fighting the wind, and looked at the exterior. Bolted to the outside of the frame was a massive, heavy-duty iron hasp designed for a thick padlock. The door could only be locked from the outside. My heart hammered against my ribs. I spun around and aimed the light at the room's single, grimy window. The glass was miraculously intact, which seemed impossible for a structure this old. As I approached, the beam illuminated the truth. Thick, industrial screws had been driven through the wooden window frame, burying deep into the surrounding logs. They had been drilled in from the outside. And right there, on the inner sill, were those same desperate, bloody scratches. Someone had tried to tear their way out with their bare hands. This cabin was not a sanctuary from the storm. It was a cage. And I had just willingly locked myself inside. This first story happened a long time ago, back when I was still completely green. I was maybe 25 years old, entirely devoid of the jagged scars, the twitchy paranoia, and the primal, rat-like survival instinct that keeps me breathing today. Back then, I used to love going on solo raids. I know, I can hear the veterans groaning through the radio waves. It sounds like absolute, suicidal lunacy to anyone who has spent more than a week out here. But back then, I craved the sensation of absolute, suffocating isolation. No radio chatter in my earpiece, no unreliable partners to watch your back or steal your loot, no faction politics. Just me, my modified AK-74, and the heavy, breathing lungs of the zone. On this particular run, I had pushed far beyond the usual safe trail stalkers used to avoid anomalies. I was edging dangerously close to the northern outskirts of the Red Forest. For those who haven't been, the Red Forest is a graveyard of rusted, decaying pine trees that soaked up so much strontium and cesium in '86 that the very soil feels toxic to your soul. For 2 days, everything was terrifyingly perfect. The weather was dead quiet, too quiet, looking back on it. I hadn't spotted a single mutated beast, not even a blind dog. The anomalies were docile and easy to read. The shimmering heat of the burners and the static crackle of their electras were highly visible in the cool autumn air. But by the afternoon of the second day, the atmosphere shifted violently. The sky to the west didn't just get dark, it turned the color of a bruised, rotting corpse, a deep, sickly purple mixed with pitch black. The air pressure dropped so fast my ears popped, and the air suddenly tasted like copper pennies and old blood. Every stalker knows that taste. A radioactive storm was rolling in, the undeniable, violent harbinger of a blowout. The wind began to howl with such sudden ferocity that the mutated, rust-colored pines around me were groaning and bending in half, their dead branches snapping off and flying through the air like shrapnel. Then came the rain. A torrential, freezing downpour of black, irradiated water started hammering the earth. I was caught in an exposed clearing, lugging a ridiculously overpacked, 60-pound canvas rucksack, and the realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. If I didn't find solid, reinforced cover in the next 10 minutes, the zone's sudden emission would boil my brain in my skull and liquefy my nervous system. Through the impenetrable wall of rain and the growing darkness, a jagged silhouette materialized in the brush. It was a small, dilapidated wooden cabin, half swallowed by overgrown, twisted thickets and creeping ivy. It looked like an old forester's hut, a rotting relic from before the disaster, completely forgotten by time and cartographers. Adrenaline masking my utter exhaustion, I threw myself at the structure. I scrambled up the rotting wooden steps of the porch and hit the heavy timber door with my shoulder, nearly shattering the warped wood. I fell inside. It was pitch black. The air inside was suffocatingly thick, reeking of damp rot, wet earth, and something vaguely metallic like rust and dried sweat. But, crucially, it was dry. The roof was holding. I collapsed onto the dust-caked floorboards, my lungs burning as I gasped for air, listening to the apocalyptic storm raging outside. When my breathing finally slowed and the immediate, blinding panic of the blowout subsided, I unclipped my tactical flashlight from my vest and clicked it on. The beam cut through the heavy gloom, illuminating the dancing dust motes. The furnishings were skeletal, exactly what you'd expect from a ruin. There was a rotting wooden table in the center of the room, a single wooden chair missing a leg, and the rusted, skeletal iron frame of a bed pushed against the far wall. An old stone fireplace, completely clogged with decades of ash, leaves, and collapsed masonry, stood on the right. I dragged myself off the floor, my muscles screaming in protest, and began to truly observe my surroundings. That's when the anomalies in the room started to register. In the far corner, nestled near the rusted bed frame, lay a sleeping bag. I walked over to it. It wasn't some moth-eaten Soviet surplus gear abandoned 30 years ago. It was modern, synthetic, and relatively clean, though stiff with cold. On the rickety table sat 3 opened cans of tourist breakfast, a half-empty plastic water jug, and a crushed pack of cigarettes. Someone had been using this forgotten, off-the-grid hut as a stash or a temporary base camp. Finding another stalker's camp isn't inherently terrifying, but the longer the beam of my flashlight lingered on the details of the room, the more a cold, paralyzing dread began to pool in my stomach. I swept the light toward the heavy timber door I had just crashed through. The wood around the inner frame was completely mutilated. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of deep, frantic scratches carved into the heavy oak. They weren't tool marks. They were chaotic, overlapping gouges, trailing downward, as if someone or something had been clawing at the thick timber in a state of absolute, mindless, agonizing panic. My hands began to tremble slightly as I stepped closer, inspecting the door's locking mechanism. There was no latch. There was no deadbolt. There was no handle on the inside whatsoever. Just a flat, scratched wooden surface. Slowly, fighting the roar of the wind, I pushed the door open a crack and shined my light on the exterior. Bolted to the outside of the frame, secured with heavy, modern lag screws, was a massive, heavy-duty iron hasp designed to hold a thick padlock. The metal bracket was thick and unyielding. The terrifying truth washed over me. This door could only be locked from the outside. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. I spun around, my flashlight beam wildly cutting across the room, and aimed it at the cabin's single, grimy window on the left wall. The glass was miraculously intact, which had seemed impossible for a structure this old in the middle of a storm. As I approached the glass, the beam illuminated the sinister reason why. Thick, industrial steel screws had been driven through the wooden window frame at every corner, burying deep into the surrounding logs. They had been drilled in from the outside, securing the window shut permanently. And right there, on the inner sill of the window, illuminated in the harsh white light of my torch, were those same desperate, bloody scratches. Deep grooves where human fingernails had split and torn in a futile attempt to pry the wood apart. Someone had tried to tear their way out of this room with their bare hands. This cabin was not a sanctuary from the storm. It was not a stalker's stash. It was a cage. An isolation cell hidden in the deepest, darkest part of the zone. And I had just willingly run inside and closed the door. 5400, Clipchamp. Are you still there, stalkers? Good. Keep your campfires stoked low, keep your backs to a solid wall, and check the magazine in your rifle. Because this is the part of the story where the zone reminds you that the real monsters don't always have invisible camouflage or tentacles. Sometimes, the most terrifying things in the exclusion zone are the ones that used to be exactly like us. I was standing dead in the center of that decaying forester's cabin, the beam of my flashlight shaking as it illuminated those bloody scratch marks on the windowsill. My survival instinct was screaming at me to kick that heavy timber door open and step back out into the irradiated downpour. But outside, the blowout was reaching its deadly crescendo. The thunder sounded like a continuous barrage of heavy artillery tearing the heavens apart. To step outside meant certain, agonizing death. The radioactive emission would fry my nervous system before I could run 100 meters. A twisted part of my mind rationalized the situation. The sleeping bag is stiff, the cans are rusted. You are completely alone here. You are safe. Just wait it out. I made the fatal choice to stay. I clicked off my flashlight to save the battery and retreated to the darkest corner of the cabin, pressing my back tightly against the damp logs. I sat down in the pitch black, my AK-74M resting across my knees. I sat in that suffocating darkness for what felt like an eternity. Time loses all its meaning when you are trapped in the dark, listening to the sky tear itself apart, just waiting for the world to stop bleeding. The torrential rain hammering on the metal roof above me was deafening, a relentless drumbeat that made it virtually impossible to hear anything beyond a few meters. Yet that is exactly why it took me so long to notice the other sound. It started as a subtle vibration. Then, cutting through the chaotic roar of the storm, I heard it clearly. Crunch. Squelch. Crunch. Footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and moving with terrifying purpose through the thick mud just outside the left wall. My breath caught in my throat. I froze completely, muscles locking up in absolute terror. I prayed to the zone it was just a blind dog seeking shelter. But then, The footsteps moved from the mud to the wood. Two heavy, distinct thuds on the rotting planks of the front porch. The undeniable sound of military-issue combat boots. A human being. My fingers gripped the cold steel receiver of my rifle. If it was a free stalker seeking shelter, they would be yelling, banging frantically on the door. But there was no voice. Just a suffocating silence beneath the noise of the rain. Then came the sound that finally sent me over the edge. The heavy timber door shuddered violently. It didn't open, but the old wood groaned as an immense physical pressure was applied from the outside. Someone had leaned their entire body weight against the wood, testing the resistance. My heart rate spiked to a lethal rhythm. The terrifying realization clicked into place. Why would someone be outside in a radioactive storm, silently testing the door without turning the handle? Unless they didn't want to come inside. They wanted to make sure the door was fully shut. The whole point was to keep the prey securely in the box. I grabbed my canvas rucksack by the straps and stood up in the dark, fueled by instinctual panic. I was seconds from charging that door when the world suddenly exploded. Behind me, thick glass shattered violently. I spun around to see a dark silhouette, a heavy glass bottle with a flaming rag stuffed in the neck, arc through the broken window. It smashed against the floorboards. It smelled like military-grade napalm. The flames erupted with explosive force. In a fraction of a second, the dark room was transformed into a roaring furnace. The wooden walls caught fire immediately, the old logs burning with a terrifying ferocity. The intense heat hit me like a physical wall. Suffocating on toxic smoke, I threw myself blindly at the door. It wouldn't budge. I slammed my shoulder into the heavy oak, screaming in pure animalistic terror. It was jammed solid from the outside. The psycho had thrown the heavy iron hasp shut. I backed up, coughing violently, and threw my entire body weight into the wood. The rotting frame finally splintered. The rusted screws tore free, and the heavy door collapsed outward. I fell out with it, tumbling down the steps into the freezing, irradiated rain. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning my rucksack to the fire, gripping only my rifle, and ran blindly into the dense, pitch-black woods. But I didn't even make it 15 meters. From the brush, a massive weight slammed into my back. The impact knocked the wind out of my lungs and sent my rifle flying into the deep darkness. I hit the mud hard. Someone was on top of me. I was fighting a desperate hand-to-hand melee for my life. The attacker didn't say a word. Just a wet, feral snarling. He smelled intensely of old blood, wet ash, and complete madness. He was tearing violently at my jacket, his calloused fingers wrapping tightly around my throat, trying to crush my windpipe while gouging wildly at my eyes. I clawed at his face. I kicked, thrashed, and screamed, the freezing mud blinding me. Losing consciousness, my right hand brushed against my tactical belt. I unclasped my combat knife, pulled the heavy steel blade free, and blindly drove the metal pommel upward into the side of his skull. The crunch of bone was sickening. His grip slackened. With a guttural scream, I bucked my hips, threw his heavy body off me into the mud, and scrambled to my feet. I didn't stop to look for my lost rifle. I just ran. I sprinted through the red forest like a hunted animal. When I finally dared to glance back, the cabin was a roaring pillar of fire, illuminating the skeletal trees in a hellish orange glow. The horrifying image of that fireball is burned into my retinas forever. I ran until my legs simply ceased to function. I found a hollow beneath the upturned roots of a fallen pine tree, crawled deep into the freezing mud, and curled into a tight ball. I spent the next 8 hours shivering in the absolute dark, bleeding, listening to the rain. I didn't know if he was tracking me. I didn't know how I survived the night, or the intense radiation. But somehow, I did. By the time the sickly light of dawn broke through the canopy, I made a solemn vow. I would never walk the zone alone again. Because whoever set that trap didn't just want to kill me. They wanted to watch me burn. It takes time for the zone to let you forget your fear. That's the most dangerous trap out here. Eventually, the paranoia dulls, the scars heal into white lines, and you start making stupid, arrogant mistakes again. You convince yourself you've mastered the wasteland. You never do. A year after that cabin burned to the ground, my partner, let's call him Skiff, found an old, classified map. It detailed a decommissioned fire watchtower deep in the uncharted woods beyond Yaniv Station. It was a massive steel skeleton, soaring at least 20 meters above the dense, mutated canopy. Skiff was an adrenaline junkie, the kind of guy who lived for the thrill of exploring places where human feet hadn't tread in decades. He talked me into it. We hacked our way through the radioactive brush and arrived at the base just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The tower was a rusted monolith, groaning in the slight breeze, but it looked structurally sound. We scaled the dizzying, treacherous ladders to the small observation cab at the very top. The panoramic view was breathtaking. The entire exclusion zone stretched out beneath us, a sprawling sea of decaying green and grey. We decided to camp up there for the night, feeling invincible above the horrors of the ground. It felt like an untouchable fortress. As night fell, the zone plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. We were sitting on the grated metal walkway outside the cab, drinking energy drinks and talking quietly. Skiff, always the fool, decided to be funny. He took his empty metal canteen and struck it hard against the steel railing. Clang! The sound was deafening. It echoed for miles across the silent forest like a sniper's gunshot. I cursed him out, whispering furiously that he was going to ring the dinner bell for every bloodsucker and mutant in the sector. 10 minutes later, Skiff stopped laughing. He tapped my shoulder, his face pale in the starlight, and pointed down into the abyss of the forest. Far below, weaving through the dense trunks, was a light. It was a pale, sickly greenish-white glow. At first, my rational mind tried to classify it. It's a stalker with a flashlight, I thought. But as I watched it move, my blood ran cold. The light didn't bob up and down with the cadence of human footsteps. It didn't swing or cast long, shifting shadows. It glided. It moved with a perfectly smooth, hypnotic horizontal trajectory, hovering about 2 meters off the ground. It was heading straight for the base of our tower. Occasionally, it would perform a terrifying, physics-defying maneuver, zipping forward 50 meters in the blink of an eye, then returning to its slow, predatory crawl. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a known anomaly like a fireball or a sparkler. It felt deliberate. It felt alive. When it finally reached the clearing directly beneath us, it stopped. It just hovered there, bathing the rusted steel supports in a sickly green luminescence. We were trapped. 70 feet in the air, with only one way down, and this thing was waiting for us. Skiff, his nerves completely shattered by the silence, leaned over the edge and yelled, "Hey, who's there?" Silence. The light didn't flinch. It didn't retreat. It just sat there, watching us from the darkness. We sat frozen on the cold metal grating for what felt like hours, afraid to even breathe. Then, I blinked, and the light was simply gone. Snuffed out like a candle in a vacuum. But the nightmare had just begun. Shortly after midnight, a horrendous noise echoed up from the base of the tower. It was a loud, metallic clanging. Then, a horrific screeching of twisting iron. It wasn't the sound of footsteps climbing the ladder. It sounded like heavy industrial sabotage. Like someone or something was down there with a sledgehammer and a blowtorch, systematically dismantling the steel supports in the pitch black. We retreated into the glass cab, pressing our backs against the heavy door, our rifles raised and aimed at the hatch. The metallic screeching continued, echoing up the structure from different angles. It was tearing the metal apart. And then, through the grimy glass of the cab window, 20 meters in the air, a silhouette drifted by. It didn't climb. It didn't crawl up the steel beams. A dark, featureless shape simply floated past the glass, blocking out the stars for a split second. My heart stopped. We stayed awake until the first rays of dawn pierced the canopy, our fingers trembling on our triggers, waiting for the door to burst open. When the sun was finally up, we cautiously opened the door and began our descent, our weapons tracking every shadow. The forest was dead silent. We made it halfway down the zigzagging stairs before Skiff froze dead in his tracks. I looked over his shoulder and felt my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. An entire 5-meter section of the heavy steel staircase was gone. It hadn't rusted away or snapped off from structural failure. The massive steel bolts had been cleanly removed, and the multi-ton iron grating had vanished completely, leaving nothing but a sheer drop to the ground below. We had to risk a terrifying, desperate jump across the gap to survive, nearly breaking our legs in the process. When we hit the ground, we searched the perimeter. There was no trace of the missing stairs. Thousands of pounds of steel, just gone. To this day, neither of us can explain what was down there, what that floating light was, or how it dismantled a steel staircase in pitch darkness without us seeing a single spark. We just know it wanted us to jump. The final story is the exact reason I never sleep without my weapon strapped tightly to my chest. It is the reason I don't trust the silence of the woods anymore, not even the rustling leaves. About 2 years ago, I was mapping a new, highly dangerous route through the treacherous swamps of Zaton. The air in the swamps is always thick, humid, and heavy with the stomach-turning stench of rotting reeds and stagnant, irradiated water. I had pushed hard that day, avoiding patches of toxic gas and navigating around the blind spots of military patrols. Near dusk, I found a relatively dry patch of elevated ground surrounded by thick, twisted brush. I set up my small one-man tent, secured my perimeter with a few simple tripwires, and collapsed onto my sleeping pad, exhausted to the bone. Sometime in the dead of night, my eyes snapped open. I wasn't woken by a noise, no snapped twig, no mutant howl, no distant gunfire. I was woken by that primal, evolutionary instinct that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. The instinct that tells you when you are no longer alone in the dark. Through the thin nylon wall of my tent, I saw a flickering, warm orange glow. It was about 200 meters away, shining faintly through the dense brush. Assuming it was a fellow loner who had made a careless camp nearby, I slowly unzipped the tent flap to take a look, my rifle raised and ready. I watched the flames dance for a few long minutes. But I heard no crackle of dry wood, no hushed voices trading stories, no clinking of metal cups. It was completely silent. Exhausted and paranoid, I zipped the tent back up and fell into a fitful, restless sleep. When the pale grey light of morning broke, curiosity got the better of me. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and walked carefully to the exact coordinates where I had seen the fire burning. When I arrived at the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The ground was entirely untouched. There were no charred logs, no circle of stones, no grey ash, no melted snow, or scorched earth. The irradiated moss was completely pristine. It was a phantom fire. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. The zone playing its usual psychological games on my tired, stressed mind. I packed up my gear and hiked deeper into the northern woods, trying hard to shake the lingering unease that clung to me like wet clothes. Night fell again. The forest canopy above me was thick, blocking out the stars. I secured my perimeter, ate cold rations in the dark, and went to sleep. Around 3 a.m., the forest erupted. A sound like a massive artillery shell detonating echoed through the trees. It was the deafening, violent crack of a massive tree trunk snapping, followed immediately by the earth-shaking thud of thousands of pounds of timber slamming into the ground. My heart hammered in my throat. I sat up, clutching my rifle in the dark. There was absolutely no wind outside. No storm. Nothing that should fell a healthy, massive tree. 10 minutes later, a second, even louder crack ripped through the dead air, much closer this time. The ground vibrated beneath my sleeping pad. But it was the sound that followed the crash that completely paralyzed me. A low, vibrating, continuous hum began to echo through the trees. It sounded like a massive, heavy engine idling, intertwined with the wet, guttural growl of a massive predator. It didn't stop to draw breath. It was a sustained, menacing vibration that I could physically feel in my teeth and the bones of my chest. I sat frozen in my tent, my finger trembling on the trigger of my rifle, staring blindly into the pitch black until the sun finally rose. As soon as there was enough light to see the barrel of my gun, I practically tore my camp down, shoving everything into my pack. I headed straight toward the site of the second fallen tree. I needed proof that I hadn't lost my mind. I found it quickly, a colossal, ancient oak, lying violently torn across the forest floor, its massive branches crushing the undergrowth. I approached the massive stump, and the sight of it made me violently nauseous. The wood hadn't snapped from stress or wind. It had been shredded. Massive, deep gouges, inches deep, tore through the dense bark and heartwood. It didn't look like it had been cut with an axe, a chainsaw, or a spatial anomaly. It looked like it had been chewed, systematically gnawed apart by something with jaws the size of a rusted car. Pure panic seized me, screaming at me to run, to abandon the route and sprint for the nearest fortified stalker camp. I turned to flee, but my eyes caught a flash of bright color draped carefully over one of the fallen oak's shattered branches. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Resting perfectly on the rough bark was a faded blue bandana and a heavily scratched climbing carabiner. My bandana. My carabiner. I tore my rucksack off my shoulders and ripped it open frantically. The items were gone. While I was asleep in my tent, completely unaware, something had unzipped my bag, rummaged silently through my belongings, selected those 2 specific items, felled a massive oak tree with its teeth, and left my gear there as a message. It was a terrifying display of dominance. It wanted me to know that it was watching, that it could have taken my life in my sleep just as easily as it took a piece of cloth. I didn't stop running until I hit the heavily guarded, reinforced gates of Yaniv Station, screaming for them to let me in. The zone is alive, my friends. And it is always, always watching us in the dark. The radio static returns, crackling loudly, almost sounding like quiet, mocking laughter. This has been Tina. Keep your heads down, trust no one, and keep your powder dry. End of broadcast.